Welcome to Living MaxJoy, the podcast helping families turn up the joy in everyday life, presented by Nemours Children's Health in partnership with ESF Camps and Experiences.
Welcome. Very excited to have you a part of this podcast today with us. Today's story is extremely powerful. It's a parent's story, why every family should know first aid. I'm sitting down with Sarah Stuebe, a good friend, a mom of four, who has an incredible story, along with Karen McCandless, who's a nurse practitioner in the pediatric division at Nemours in Delaware. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
So I want to take a moment to share that I've known Sarah most of my life as a young person, but also to see her go to college and then also become a nurse and then get married and now to have these four amazing children. When this incident happened, and I was pretty impacted and affected not only as a friend, but also as a parent. And so I would love to begin by having you, Sarah, kind of tell the story about what happened to Oscar.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. Yes, as you said, I am the mom of four boys, very active boys, all big sports enthusiasts and baseball lovers. And 2 years ago, in March 2024, three of my four boys were playing baseball and rec, and my, at the time, 7-year-old was playing in a travel baseball league. And Oscar was asked to play in a doubleheader that weekend. He was on the same rec team as the 7-year-old brother, Connor, and, didn't think twice about it. Went to the field. Everybody was there. The first game went off without any problems. And then we had about an hour break, and then the second game started. And Oscar was, I think it was the third inning. We usually play 5. If it's close, we'll play a 6th inning. And third inning, he was playing center field. And the other team was up at bat. A kid hit a pretty unremarkable pop fly, something that we've seen 100 times before. And Oscar rushed to the ball. His mitt was in the air. And initially, it looked like he caught it. And me and my friends in the stands were cheering, dancing. And then all of a sudden, we realized that the ball actually dropped out of his mitt. And you could hear the groan from the stands. And then all of a sudden, he kind of took 2 steps forward and then collapsed. And, I didn't think anything of it, thought the wind had got knocked out of him. I was like, he's going to get up, no problem. The coaches of the opposing team were on the field already at base coaching. So they immediately ran to him. My husband, who was also assisting their team, was in the dugout, ran out. And then, they were all kneeling beside Oscar. And then my husband pretty much jumped up and screamed my name. And I knew then, by the tone of his voice, that something was seriously wrong. So I grabbed my phone out of the stands and immediately called 911 without even seeing Oscar and just running to the field. When I got to Oscar, it looked like he was having a seizure. His body was convulsing. His arms were contracted. He had urinated over himself on his baseball pants. And, I am a trained nurse, registered nurse, and I've seen seizures before. Oscar didn't have any seizure history or any underlying medical condition. But, I was like, okay, he's having a seizure. Let's just time it. And then all of a sudden, the color left his face and his body. He became kind of this like dusty gray color, stopped moving. And then he started doing this weird breathing, which is agonal breathing. It was this gasping for air. My husband was next to me, and he was like, Oscar, come on, just come up. You're swimming, take a deep breath. And I had known from my CPR training, this breathing is not normal. And when you see something like this, not normal, you start CPR. So that's where my brain was. I checked for a pulse, didn't find anything. And then, I kind of had this out of body experience, and I was like, okay, my training is telling me it's time to start CPR. So I started CPR, again, not really realizing this was my son at the time. I shouted out for an AED, and I do remember it was like as if I was in a movie, looking up at these stands. You couldn't see anybody move. It was like a 20 blank stares looking at me, and nobody moved. And I'm just doing CPR, and nobody is bringing me an AED. And then suddenly, after about like a minute and a half, 2 minutes, I had the realization, like, I'm doing CPR on my 6-year-old son. I was supposed to be at a baseball game with my family and then meet my parents later for a barbecue. This doesn't happen to kids, and I shouldn't be doing CPR on a healthy 6-year-old. And so I started to kind of like crumble, and my husband's kind of freaking out next to me. And I, like, out of the corner of my eye, I see this woman like rushing to the field, and she is body checking me out of the way and is taking over. And I'm just kind of like beside myself at this point. Out of my peripheral vision, I can see this woman going to town on my son. She is pushing hard and fast. And then what seemed like forever, but was actually under 4 minutes, the ambulance arrived, and they got Oscar, cut his shirt, cut his pants, everything, connected him to some sort of machine. And then, we're loading him into the ambulance. And, all my kids are there. I have 3 other children, but my priority is Oscar. I'm trying to get into the back of the ambulance. And the guy's looking at me like, you can't be back here. We need all hands on deck. So my husband and I, kind of in a daze, are loaded into the cab of the ambulance fire truck. And, I'm yelling out. I have no idea where my kids are at this point. I'm just yelling out to parents, friends, and like, get my kids. And, I could see everyone just like, blank stares. So my husband and I were pretty religious, and, we were in that car ride. It was probably the scariest moment of my life. I've said this before, like, I've watched too many TV shows, and, just thinking like, this is it. My kid's, dead in the back of the ambulance, and, no one's telling me anything. My husband and I are like, he was in the front next to the driver. I was kind of in the back seat with a woman who I was like, thought that she was like a chaplain or something, but ended up being just a ride along. But, my husband and I are holding hands. We're praying profusely, and my husband's yelling at the driver, asking for information. And he's like, I'm driving. I have no idea what's happening in the back. But he put a video up, and there's, about 6 guys working on this little 6-year-old body in the back. And we get to the hospital, which we were lucky enough to be 10 minutes away from a trauma 1 hospital, which there's only 9 in the state of Florida. And my husband, I don't think it even came to a complete stop when he was out of the cab and banging on the back of the door to ask if he was alive. And they didn't answer us. They said, we need to get him inside. So they took us to a small waiting room. And again, back to all the ER shows, I'm like, this is where they're going to tell me they tried everything and they couldn't save him. And so again, what seemed like forever, my parents had come at this point, and we are, on our hands and knees praying that they save Oscar, and just waiting. And finally, Andrew, I'll never forget, an ER nurse came back, and he said, Oscar's alive. He said, we got a pulse. but he's not breathing on his own. So he said, and give us a couple minutes and you can come back and see him. And we went into the emergency room, and he was connected to machines. His color was still not there. His little body, and it was just it's surreal. And we had an amazing trauma doctor there who was didn't sugarcoat anything, which I very much appreciated. And he said, he's here, we have a pulse, but this is a very critical time. We're just going to have to wait and see if there's any brain damage. And I'm like, brain damage? What are we talking about here? And I kept being asked by the trauma doctor, the respiratory therapist, any of the nurses, what happened, and when was CPR started. And again, time goes by so fast and yet so slow at the same time. I thought I started it pretty fast, but, did I start it in time? And, that was just, the beginning of the waiting game. So he was moved up to ICU, or the PICU, the pediatric ICU. And we were met by a cardiologist. And he said, it looks like this is commotio cordis, where he was hit by the ball and it went into this ventricular fibrillation. And we're just going to have to wait and see if it recovers and, if he has any brain damage. And then, so Oscar was in the hospital for about a week. That was Sunday afternoon that the cardiac arrest happened. And I think Monday night, they ended up extubating him. And, he was breathing on his own again. His heart rate was still a little erratic. And then, he didn't really get any sleep, even though he was in this comatose state. They said, your body's not really asleep. So he was, hallucinating, talking, not making sense. It was hard to understand him, slurring his words. So we kind of were like, oh my gosh, this is the brain damage they were talking about. And then finally, my husband is kind of going all places. I'm like, we got to take it day by day, step by step, hour by hour. He finally fell asleep, and that's what the medicine that he needed. He fell asleep, and Wednesday morning, he woke up at I want to say 1 a.m., and he looked at me and said, "Hi, Mom." And he knew who I was. He was making sense, and I woke up Riley, and I said, he's back. He's back. And again, crying. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It was a true miracle that our son survived. And, for the next couple of days, he had physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. He basically had to relearn to walk, hold utensils. But very happy to say that on Friday afternoon, he walked out of the pediatric ICU seemingly, unscathed. And then, a week later, we did a follow-up with the cardiologist who was crying almost, telling me, he said, when you guys came in, I was there. And I said, don't remember you. But he said, I cannot believe that you are here and I'm speaking with Oscar, who seems like a completely normal 6-year-old. So he was the one who basically said, Mom, this is, thanks to you and early CPR, that is why he is still alive and here today.
Well, Sarah, first of all, thank you so much for taking us through this, horrific story, an experience that you've probably said to so many people, and to do this discussion with us is extremely valuable for all of us, because I think we're going to take away so many important tips and best practices of what to do in the future. Karen, looking back, how critical were those first few minutes before paramedics arrived?
The most critical. Those first 3 minutes within when a cardiac arrest happens, that's your window of opportunity to save this person. And so it's imperative that somebody start chest compressions immediately. And it's difficult because, as Sarah said, sometimes it looks like they're having a seizure. So how long do you wait? And what do you do? But it became clear to Sarah, and it sounds very classic. His color changed, his breathing changed. That's telling you this is not a seizure. Put your hands on that chest and start compressions, which is thankfully exactly what Sarah did.
Yeah. And luckily Sarah was an RN, but this was her son, Oscar's. And, what you went through and how you explained that, Sarah, was unbelievable. You almost went into nurse mode, you mentioned, but then you were starting to get extremely worried, which
Normal.
yeah,
Right?
can't even imagine.
Crazy. It really is an amazing story.
Sarah, walk us through the PICU and those days and the uncertainty about Oscar's brain and with that lack of oxygen. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So with CPR, when your heart is in that arrhythmia, it's fatal if you don't do anything. So what CPR really does, and Karen, you can speak to it again as a medical professional, that you are basically with CPR, you're doing the work of the heart. You're perfusing, most importantly, the brain with blood that carries oxygen. If your brain or any other organ doesn't get oxygen, it's called ischemia, and it's cell death. So if you go too long or wait too long to start CPR, then that cell death happens and that leads to that brain damage. So because Oscar was put in this induced coma, basically, with the sedatives and the ventilator, they couldn't assess brain function. They really had to wait to see what his mental state would be when he woke up. When he did finally get extubated and was, awake, like I said before, he was hallucinating. He wasn't making sense. He had no idea who I was. He had no idea who my husband was. He was seeing like jungle animals on the ceiling. And it was too short of a stay, and the doctors and nurses told me that he didn't get enough of medication to be considered psychosis. So we were trying to maybe get a brain scan, MRI of his brain, just to see if they could see any of that like ischemia. But he ended up having, his heart was basically hit, bruised, inflamed, and he was having some residual unnatural rhythms that they said they didn't want to put him under any sedation for the brain MRI. So we just waited. And then luckily, that didn't happen because, again, that CPR was started in time and his brain was perfused.
Karen, what exactly is commotio cordis, and why can a seemingly routine hit to a chest truly impact the heart, especially of a child like Oscar?
Well, it's commotio cordis is a technically rare event. And what happens is the heart takes a blow or the chest takes a blow, and if it happens right at the right time during the EKG, where you have the up, down kind of thing, if it happens right in the right timing, the heart will just sort of stop. And it needs to be restarted. And that's exactly what happened in Oscar's case, similar to Damar Hamlin, who we've probably all heard about, same type of thing. And although they say it's rare, I think maybe 300 cases a year, give or take, but it may not quite be as rare as we think.
Are more certain body types or ages more susceptible to this or more vulnerable?
No, in my mind, I would have never expected a 6-year-old out in center field or out in the field catching a pop fly to suffer commotio cordis. Like, you expect it, okay, well, if he was a pitcher and took a line drive at the age of 12, you wouldn't imagine this, but a 6-year-old does not have a lot of protection. They don't have a lot of fat underneath their skin to protect the sternum, and potentially they are more at risk. If the timing is all right, and it is just one of those perfect storms, unfortunately.
It was amazing when Sarah was sharing with us how she was trying to identify the problem. She went from really thinking that it was actually a seizure or a concussion to having no pulse, right? And so, the critical distinction, how do you really, how can we explain to parents what is the difference?
That's such a great question, and I think is a lot of the reason why when somebody has a cardiac arrest, whether it's a child or an adult, people are so hesitant to actually start chest compressions because, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it's not, maybe somebody more qualified will come along, and they kind of just wait. But as Sarah mentioned, and it's classic, the color change in the child's face, he became very ashen because there's no oxygen floating through his bloodstream. And the breathing changes too. Now, if you're just having a seizure, usually that's time limited. It doesn't go on for a very long time. And in this case, he was still having the convulsive movements, but then his breathing changed and his color changed. And Sarah must have felt for a pulse, which is also kudos, because in the midst of all of that with the adrenaline, I can't imagine how hard it is to find a pulse, even if you're a nurse. But that's really the only way to know, is you're just looking for the color changes, the breathing, and feeling for a pulse.
And if a parent sees a child collapse on the sports field, what would you recommend?
Get there, call 911, and do that very brief assessment. Give it 10, 15, 20 seconds. And then if nothing is happening, if there's no normal breathing, if the color is changing, just start chest compressions. You're not going to hurt somebody by doing chest compressions. The worst probably that'll happen is they'll wake up and they'll be annoyed at you.
And so how important was it that Sarah began CPR immediately?
Completely. It's the game changer. Honestly, Sarah saved her own son's life. There's no question about it, as did the other people that then jumped in and helped. But if it hadn't been for her quick instinct to get her hands on that chest and start compressing, the outcome would have probably been very different. The outcome to survive an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, it's so small, about 10% or so people will survive that. So every minute that you don't start compressions or get an AED and all of those things, that statistic drops lower and lower. It's just astounding.
Sarah, I know that you were asking for an AED. Did they have an AED on site that just never got to you? Was it somewhere located that nobody could find, or did they not have one present?
So our field was currently under construction, the concession stand. The president of our park had said that there was usually a AED in the concession stand, but on that specific day, there was not one. There are no laws in Florida that there has to be be an AED at a sports field, a baseball field. And that's what we are now trying to change. So, it actually happened. Another commotio cordis case happened about 3 weeks after Oscar's cardiac arrest, about 20 minutes west of us. He was a little older than Oscar. I think he was 10 at the time. And he was stealing second, and a pitcher threw it to the second baseman, but actually ended up hitting the runner, and same thing happened. Commotio cordis, went into cardiac arrest. Luckily, there was a nurse parent there who did start CPR, and there was an AED at that field, and it was used, and he was revived on the field. So, every child is different. Every child has, different, medical history, underlying conditions or whatnot. But I do believe that if an AED was there, that Oscar might have been revived on the field. We would have not had to stay at the PICU for so long. Granted, I'm so happy that he survived, but, that option of being prepared and expecting the worst, that's what our whole mission is now. And after we started a foundation to help others.
Talk to us about this. I love how you've taken a negative experience, you've turned it into a positive one. You've created a foundation by the name of Oscar Strong Foundation. Tell us a little about that.
Yes. So people look at me, after this happened, they were sending me all kinds of therapists' numbers. You experience the worst kind of trauma. And, I am lucky enough to have a very good friend who is a therapist who did talk to me, but I felt like my real therapy was doing something. So when Oscar finally woke up on that Wednesday, my husband and I kind of looked at each other and just said, this is a miracle. We are the lucky ones. And, from what all the doctors had told us, later on, the first responders that responded to Oscar's call said that, he shouldn't have survived this. And, Riley and I, we just said, no, we have to do something to let other parents know that this can happen. This can happen to your child, a healthy 6-year-old. Cardiac arrests don't just happen to older people. They can happen any place, anytime, anywhere. And, for baseball, after this incident, I think we mentioned Damar Hamlin, my husband and I watched Damar Hamlin. We watched that Monday Night Football game live. I saw his arm go up and again, kind of be contracted. And I was like, he's having a seizure. And, it obviously happened. It was commotio cordis. And, I thought my kids are not playing tackle football. They are playing baseball. But baseball is actually the sport that commotio cordis incidences are highest in. So, again, my husband and I had a mission right then and there at the hospital. We need to make a difference. So we created the Oscar Strong Foundation, which is to reduce the risks of preventable sudden cardiac arrest in youth sports. And that is by educating everybody on CPR. So hands-only CPR. I said earlier, I checked Oscar's pulse. I didn't need to do that. If I see those signs, breathing abnormally, not unresponsive, you start CPR. So educating people on the importance of CPR, educating people on cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is different than a heart attack. Cardiac arrest is an electrical issue. There's an electrical issue with the heart, unlike a heart attack, which is usually a plumbing issue or a blockage somewhere. Usually with a heart attack, the person is conscious. The person can verbalize, I'm having chest pain. With cardiac arrest, they collapse suddenly. They are unresponsive. They are not talking to anybody. They are not breathing. So educating people on what that looks like, especially in children, in youth sports athletes, so that people are aware that this can happen and what to do. And then we also advocate for increased public access to AEDs. So if you go around to the places where you go most, restaurants, gyms, doctor's offices, I tell people, be aware. Where is the AED? And usually, unfortunately, it's behind a locked door. It's behind a locked cabinet. It's not accessible and it's not visible, if it's even there. So we have started a mission to put as many AEDs in places where kids are doing sports, whether that's the ice rink, the tennis court, the field, gym, multi-purpose fields, wherever, there should always be an AED. And then lastly, protective equipment. I had no idea that that this was a risk of playing baseball, that this injury was common, or more common than other sports, and that there was protection that he could have been wearing. After research, it's not a totally 100% foolproof gear, but it does reduce the risk by a lot. I think it's about 70%. And I would like to think that if I had known about it, that Oscar would have been wearing a shirt. Kind of like how, when people ski, they have helmets, or when you're in the car, you have a seatbelt on. You're doing a preventative action to prevent the unthinkable.
Yeah, I'd like to unpack a number of those incredible tips that you've given. First with the AEDs, Karen, and it's so critical in youth sports. How fast should one be using one of those after a collapse?
Well, the good thing about these AEDs, which stands for automatic external defibrillator, is you don't have to worry about analyzing the rhythm. You just have to get that AED to the patient while somebody is doing chest compressions. And then you place the pads. The AEDs explain everything as you're in the moment. It's a recorded voice. It'll say, undo the pads, place on the chest. Very clear instructions. And then you place them on the chest, and it will tell you when to get your hands off the patient. And at that point, you can stop CPR while it's analyzing. And the machine will tell you whether a shock is needed or not. And there's basically one button on these AEDs, the shock button. And so you just press that button and it will provide the shock.
Can an untrained parent safely use an AED?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, like I said, it's very self-explanatory. The machine tells you exactly what to do as you're doing it.
What misconceptions would a parent have that would hold them back from even acting that and using it?
Well, especially in a case like this, the 6-year-old, somebody might think, oh my gosh, these AEDs are meant for adult bodies. Like, is this okay? Can we put this on? Absolutely. You can use the same device on an adult versus a child. And again, a lot of times it's just the hesitation. And maybe it's partly our subconscious trying to say, this can't really be happening. But people want to wait and say, give him a minute. Let's see, maybe he's coming around. There's really not the time for that, because if you don't get the blood pumping through oxygen to the brain within 3 minutes, it's a really poor outcome.
Tell us a little more about Project Adam with Nemours' initiative, and tell us a little more about that.
Absolutely. So Project Adam is named after a boy who was 17 in, I think it was Wisconsin. He died of a sudden cardiac arrest while playing basketball at his high school. His parents were there. There was not an AED available. And just like Sarah, after that tragic event, they felt they had to do something. So they worked with the hospital and the cardiologists, and they started this program called Project Adam, and it stands for Automated Defibrillators in Adam's Memory. And I think it was around 2012 or 2016 that they began bringing this to schools. And so Project Adam will designate a school as being heart safe. And what that means is that the staff has they've been trained. They don't all have to have CPR certification, but there should be some that do. They should be trained. They have to have a cardiac emergency response plan. So preparing for these things, and then running a drill periodically to make sure that we can get an AED to any area of that school within 3 minutes. And so they run a drill, and after all of those things are completed, we give them a designation as heart safe, and they get a banner and things like that.
In 2012, I'm happy to say our medical team at ESF heard about Project Adam. And so we have AEDs at each one of our locations because of
It's amazing.
Project Adam.
It's great. And Nemours became an affiliate. We worked for Dr. Sean Connolly is the medical director that I worked very closely with. His efforts were incredible for about a year. It took for Nemours to become an affiliate. So we are designating schools within the state of Delaware. We're trying to do it, you're trying to do it regionally. Right now, there's about 53 affiliates over 36 states or so, and most of them are large freestanding children's hospitals. And we then assist the schools in our region to become heart safe.
Yeah.
And
Sarah, tell us how this has changed you as a parent, this experience.
So I would say it has unleashed, unlocked fear, I would say. I did meet the parents of the child that it happened, that he had a commotio cordis, cardiac arrest, 3 weeks after Oscar. And he kind of said it to me, you see it once and you think it's going to happen all the time. And I'm not living in a bubble, I promise. My kids are actually still playing baseball. Oscar is still playing. He's an all-stars. He's a game tonight. We just wear chest protection. Everybody does, whether you're playing outside in the backyard, whether you're playing a game. If you're throwing a ball, you have it on. But it really enlightened me. And one of the big takeaways is don't make the error of assumption. Don't assume that somebody else knows CPR. Don't assume that somebody else knows what it's going, what to do in this situation. I tell everybody, thankfully I was a nurse and I had this training. I have 4 children. I took the infant CPR with my first child, but if I wasn't a nurse and didn't have to keep up my BLS, I might have not taken a second infant CPR class. It's kind of like you check the box once. So, I just, you never assume that it's not going to happen to you, and don't assume that you're relying on other people to know what to do in those circumstances.
Sarah, you got active kids. First of all, congratulations to Oscar with playoffs tonight. So we're excited to hear how he does. But what do you wish every sports parent whose youth are participating, what would you like them to understand from this experience?
So again, don't make the error of assumption. Ask those questions. Is the coach CPR certified? Is there a cardiac emergency action plan in place? Is there an AED at the field? If your child's, traveling to other fields, rinks, or courts, will there be an AED there? That goes for school teams as well. Sometimes schools have those AEDs, but when they're playing an away game, is that other school have the same practices that you do? So again, don't make that error of assumption.
Talk about the protective equipment too. What role should we as parents always, try to mitigate? For instance, my oldest, 13 years old, right away when we had this discussion last week, I went out and purchased, the top that you suggested, which was phenomenal. But first thing my son said before he put it on was, "Oh, this will slow me down." I'm like, "No, this is going to protect you." Talk about that a little more.
Yeah. So, that is, I think it's a common misconception. My kids all wear it. They're young. Even my 5-year-old who plays t-ball, which, the ball's not going fast. It doesn't need to be going fast, but, they're definitely not going to be, causing any cardiac arrests. But I'm having him wear it to get used to it. It's not an option. It's kind of like it's not an option when you get into a car and getting your seatbelt on. And there's a lot on the market. But I did a lot of research, and I don't get any kickbacks or anything from this one company, but Unequal Technologies makes a great heart. It's called a heart shirt. It's Kevlar, what basically bulletproof vests are made out of. It's very surprisingly light, and it just absorbs the impact. It's, kind of like that tight, athletic, kind of like Under Armour feel. It's supposed to be tight fitting, and it's not a choice in my house. All my friends who were there that day, have since moved on to other teams, and they spread the word, and it's like boys wearing cups at baseball. You have to prevent the injury, and there was an article written in our area after his cardiac arrest, and the article kind of missed the mark, in my opinion, which was, how young is too young for travel baseball? And commotio cordis is not an injury based on ability. I believe there was a D1 baseball player who this happened to as well, also survived. But, this is not a kid that didn't know what he was doing and put in an unfair situation. It can happen to anyone. It was just the wrong place, wrong time. But that very specific time in that cardiac cycle that this happened. So it's not ability. It's just a freak accident. But it's an accident that happened to us that I never thought we would be those people. Like I never thought that, that time watching that Monday Night Football game that, DeMar Hamlin and Oscar would have this shared experience.
Sarah, the preparedness questions every family should ask their league, their team, their camp, what would you recommend?
So again, no hands-only CPR. Ask if the coach knows CPR, kind of like Project Adam, can we get this team, school, camp, heart safe certified? Someone was giving me an example, we have fire drills all the time in school. Thankfully we haven't had a fire tragedy at school, but I believe cardiac arrest is the number one killer of students, and particularly student athletes. So, why aren't we doing these drills in schools? And, I applaud Project Adam because they are doing amazing things, and getting this on people's radar.
And I also would like to point out that, Oscar has a normal heart, had a normal heart before this, still has a normal heart. His event was just timing related and the hit to the chest. But about 1 in about 300 children has an undiagnosed cardiac condition. And sometimes the first time the parent learns about it is when their child goes down in a cardiac arrest. And that's very unfortunate. So we do what we can to protect our kids, the safety equipment and things like that. Sometimes you just don't know. Yes, we're doing more routine screenings. But again, even if Oscar had had an EKG before that game, it would have been normal. He would have not required anything specific. So I think, as Sarah has said over and over, it's so important for people to know the signs and what it looks like and how to react.
I think staying aware, having that situational awareness without being afraid is so key. Realizing that this can happen. And if so, this is what you got to do.
Exactly.
I just think today, has reinforced that piece that you can't expect that the coach or the umpire or the opposing team has. You just almost have to just look at, it's almost like looking for fire exits,
Absolutely.
as when you go into a building or things like that. So, Sarah, talk a little bit more about Oscar Strong Foundation. A lot of the things that you spoke about today is available on the website. Is that correct?
Yes. And before I was thinking, I probably learned to consolidate my mission statement a little bit, but I could go on forever. But yes, I would say our biggest initiative now is just, again, like Karen said, having people recognize what sudden cardiac arrest looks like, empowering people to step in to do CPR. You're not going to hurt anybody if they don't need it. They might be a little sore. They might tell you to buzz off. But you're not going to do any damage if they don't need it. And if they do need it, you'll save their life. Again, one of our biggest initiatives now is that we are installing these save stations, which are outdoor and indoor, but mostly outdoor units that are freestanding. They're freestanding towers or wall mounts, and they house an AED. These save stations are open. They're open 24/7. So you don't need a lock. You don't need a key or a code to access it. And we've partnered with the city of West Palm Beach in Florida And I think we are now in 12 different parks. And these are all by basketball courts, tennis courts, multi-purpose fields, baseball fields, where people are bringing their families. There's pickup basketball games all around. And again, we're trying to get the word out about these heart protection shirts as much as we can. We're going to try to do some grant programs with AEDs. We are donating 4 AEDs to a local school so that they can have those AEDs when they do have those away games. So they don't need to rely on the other school.
5 years from now, what are some of the dreams and hopes that you would hope that through the Oscar Strong Foundation you would have achieved?
I would say, again, I want to do, reach as many people about CPR. You don't need to get certified. It would be great to have, like an ad campaign you see on TV. The time that has a commercial, you can learn CPR. I want to get AEDs to be as recognizable as fire extinguishers. You can see where fire extinguishers are in your restaurants, in your stores, everywhere. And again, I just want to continue putting in these public access AEDs so that, people walking by, look and say, hey, what's that? And they can learn something about it. And again, if you listen to the news, a lot of states are getting on board. A lot of schools and laws are going into place about having these action plans, the emergency action plans, knowing what to do and being prepared. And I would love to see that, I don't know if it's a 5-year. I mean, hopefully we can do it within 5 years, but get it on, instead of state level, get it on the national level.
Karen, what more can we do to help advance the Oscar Strong Foundation and Project Adam in your eyes?
I think it's all about awareness, making people aware. And one of the things that Sarah said just a minute ago, which is so important, is you don't have to have a CPR certification to do chest compressions on somebody. And in some ways, I think years back, when we took CPR classes, you had to remember how many compressions to breaths if there's one responder versus 2 responders, and how deep to compress on the chest. That's daunting to people, and it may make people afraid to do anything because they're afraid they'll do it wrong. Hands-only CPR is just as effective, and in fact, Nemours with our Project Adam work, we go out to American Heart Association walks, and we've done sidewalk CPR. We just set up our mannequins, and anybody walking by can just practice because it's so important.
One last question. That is this. Since you're both medical professionals, I would love to know, what is the kindest thing that somebody's ever done for you who was a stranger?
There's a simple thing too. These things can be so simple. I remember years ago when my children were very little, I had 3 young boys myself. They're in the shopping cart. I'm at the grocery store and trying to load my things into the car, and the shopping cart almost rolls away. And some woman just came up to me and said, I've been where you are. You just get your kids settled in the car and I'll put your groceries in the car for you. And that was probably 25 years ago. And I still remember that to this day. Just a selfless stranger who saw somebody who was struggling a little bit. And that one just pops right into my head every time I think of that. But there's always so many.
Thank you for sharing. Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for your time. Sarah, your powerful story will truly impact all of us. And to get more information about the Oscar Strong Foundation and all the great works that Nemours is doing, you can find all this information at nemours.org, as well as the Oscar Strong Foundation. And I want to thank you both for the conversation today, the impactful conversation, and all that you do for us.
Thank you.
Thanks
so
again.
Much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Today's episode was brought to you by ESF Camps and Experiences in partnership with Nemours Children's Health. For more information, visit esfcamps.com/Nemours or click the link in the episode description. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep living MaxJoy.